Hello, welcome back to the second part of my older adult video presentation. Some biopsychosocial factors that inhibited the resolution of the psychosocial crisis. Lack of financial resources to leave. She did work but did not make a lot of money. That would allow her to start over by getting an apartment and being able to be self-sufficient for her and her children so she could meet their needs. Her paycheck went right to her husband, and she got an allowance of $5 a week. In that time, $5 did not even go far, even back then. So she had a strong fear of not being able to keep an apartment, work, and keep her children with her. So while she was very unhappy in the marriage, she was motivated to stay out of fear of losing her children to the Children Protective Services within New York. Cultural and religious beliefs is a strong inhibiting factor as well. Culturally, her family is Italian, and she advised me that she was raised to be subservient to her husband. She was raised very traditionally. Her parents immigrated from Sicily and had a lot of old world beliefs that she was raised to adhere to, but struggled with as she got older and was living in an abusive marriage. Isolation. She was isolated from many of her friends and her family, was not supportive of her leaving him because of their Catholic faith. And what she experienced was considered a norm in the family and not a reason to break her vows and leave her husband. So she was basically encouraged to stay out of commitment and her faith in God. Some biopsychosocial factors that facilitated the resolution of the psychosocial crisis or facing reality. When her daughter got physically assaulted, this was an eye-opening event that her husband had no limits and crossed a boundary that she would no longer tolerate. And I quote, "He could do what he wanted to me, but not to my children." So he just really crossed a boundary that was a deal breaker for her, by causing trauma to not only her, but to the children as well. Accepted support. She was willing and able to accept support from women she worked with that connected to her to community resources. So they connected her to shelters and food banks in New York City. She was also able to reconnect with a friend that was living in Pennsylvania, and they had a strong relationship during their childhood and adolescence, and they reconnected, and she helped her move to Pennsylvania, helped her get stable housing and employment. So that was a strong support system, and they are actually still very close till this day. Another motivating factor was she was protecting her children. She didn't want her children abused and was motivated to protect them by leaving the unhealthy marriage and just leaving everything behind. Facilitating factors that helped her overcome oppression. In terms of society, domestic violence was being spoken about and awareness was made. In social terms, domestic violence was being talked about more. Women were encouraged to leave unsafe situations, report domestic violence, and domestic violence was starting to be very talked about in the public. So this helped her reach out to crisis centers for women and children. Another facilitating factor was the use of the community resources, such as shelters and domestic violence crisis centers up in New York City. That helped her and her children with counseling and safety. I believe this also ties into the Women's Live movement, as women were starting to speak out more about issues of violence that caused them to be oppressed in relationships such as physical, financial, sexual, and emotional abuse was really starting to be recognized in society, and really women were encouraged to talk and not keep it quiet. So some inhibiting factors of oppression were she experienced strong cultural and religious expectations to be obedient to her husband and remain in the marriage. Even though it was unhealthy and a significant amount of abuse occurred, she mentioned that people did not air their dirty linen and that she was not encouraged to talk about her marital problems, but encouraged to pray. She was encouraged to really ignore his external affairs and not provoke him to be mad or he would punish her. This all reinforced that she was the cause of relationship problems and decompensated her mental health, her sense of self, and really reinforced isolation during developmental phase of 6. Some biosocial factors or events that inhibited the resolution of the psychosocial curses were influenced by the way she was raised. Cultural expectations of the female role in marriage. She was raised in a patriarchal family and married into one as well. She was not allowed to question anything. She had no say in big decisions. She had to be obedient or risk the consequence of abuse and punishment. Her husband held the control of the relationship and limited what she could do, who she could talk to, where she could go. She identified her parents' relationship as hers, and this caused her to further isolate from her family and have limited contact with them because they just were not supportive of her. She witnessed unhealthy communication and abuse patterns between her parents as well. This was an accepted behavioral norm in the family. Therefore, she formed her relationship with her husband based on her parents' relationship. It was abusive and lacked healthy communication, which resulted in a patriarchal structure. She lived in an all-Italian neighborhood and felt limited as to whom she could talk to because her views on her marital situation were outside the norm from everyone around her, she felt, and therefore reinforcing isolation and a lack of healthy relationship development. So another developmental theory that I felt was tied into her developmental stage of crisis was Bandura's social learning theory. It really fit her life stage best. Environmental and cognitive factors interconnect to influence human learning and behavior. Behavior is learned from the environment through the process of observational learning. Her traditional Italian family was strongly influenced by their Catholic faith. Her family was adhering to the roles and norms that they formed prior to immigrating to the United States in 1954 and viewed disobedience in the marriage as not following her faith. Divorce is viewed as a mortal sin. My client learned and observed that the relationship included abuse, aggressive communication, a power and control element, as well as a subservient role for females. I quote, "I learned to stay in my marriage, endure the abuse, and put up with the affairs because that is what my mother did. The level of commitment in marriage is directly associated with observational learning, and relationship dynamics are influenced by early exposure." Again, this reinforces what she learned from her parents. Relationships such as the dynamic and unhealthy pattern of communication and abuse, which limited her development of healthy communication. An interesting aspect is that she remained married, but she had no contact with her husband. She's still married. They have no contact with each other. Her son has no contact with him, but ironically, her daughter has an active relationship with him, even though he physically abused her when she was a child. My client remains to struggle with developmental relationships and trusting people. In the beginning of our relationship, it was a struggle for us to talk because she was really scared to let people in and connect with me. But I was really consistent, and I really tried hard to gain her trust, and she finally realized I was someone that she could trust and confide in. She remains single and identifies herself as being content. To quote her, "I do not want to ever have an intimate relationship with a man out of fear of abuse and losing control over life. It is not worth my time or the hassle." She said something a little more profane, but I decided to clean it up. She's a very interesting person, and sadly is very still traumatized by what her husband had done to her, and how her family thought it was okay for this to continue to happen without supporting her. So she has no contact with her family as well in New York. Some limitations. I want to point out that there are limitations to all psychosocial developmental theories, as they all really focus on childhood and adolescence. But in conclusion, some limitations of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development are a limited view of development that occurs in adulthood. People may change their identity that forms in adolescence just as society changes. Self-growth emerges as individuals have more life experience, and this can impact their identity that was formed as a teenager. My client admitted she questioned her identity through her marriage experience. You cannot lock a person into a specific stage based on their age because development occurs as an individual pace. Age-related norms and expectations continually evolve and change. My client was expected to marry young, establish a home, and have a child. But today's standards, this practice of belief is antiquated. And this is my presentation, and I Hope you enjoyed, and good luck to everybody.